Mornings can be hectic. We get it. You're pressed for time, but you still want to stay informed. Let the connector from Boise State Public Radio do the work for you. Every weekday morning, this quick and convenient podcast delivers the top Idaho news stories you need to know, all in the time it takes to brew your coffee or start your commute. No scrolling, no searching, just hit play and get connected. Listen to the Connector Idaho Daily News wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. Tomorrow, January 14th, marks a unique anniversary here in the Gem State. It will be 30 years after the reintroduction of wolves into Idaho. It was a cold January day when a small group of people carried 4 big metal crates through the snow and set them down at the Corn Creek campground not far from Salmon, Idaho. Then they opened those crate doors and released 4 gray wolves from Alberta, Canada, into the wilderness. Now, some of the folks who were there are looking back at that day and at the last 30 years with wolves in Idaho. And they'll be talking tonight at a special webinar put on by the International Wildlife Coexistence Network. Suzanne Aisha Stone was there 30 years ago, and she actually released one of those wolves. She is now the executive director of the network, and she's joining us live to talk more. Suzanne, welcome.
Hi, Gemma. Thanks for celebrating this day and time with us. 30 years. Can you believe it?
Oh, no, I cannot believe it. I was just a little tiny baby reporter back then. And I don't know. I actually can't remember, Suzanne, if I was there on this particular day or if I was there a week or two later when more wolves were released. But I have very vivid memories of this and frankly, being completely lost, not understanding the significance of this. So, with that said, let's go back to January of 95 before the actual reintroduction. What was happening then? Where were there wolves in Idaho before this point?
So the last wolf that they recorded was killed in Idaho in the 1930s. And for the next, 60, 70 years, there were no evidence of wolves, other than occasionally we would get a disperser down from Canada. Wolves were starting to make their way into northwestern Montana from Canada, and those populations were always one large population. There was never a Canadian wolf versus an Idaho wolf or a Montana wolf. So they were all integrated at one point, and yet in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, they've been completely eradicated from the landscape by the 1930s.
So why did some groups, Suzanne, want to bring wolves back after, as you mentioned, upwards of 65 years?
So about the time that wolves were listed under the Endangered Species Act, that was in the 1970s. And the country was really exploring this relationship with nature. We were starting to realize that we were losing some pretty major components of our ecosystem and our wildlife populations across the country. And that led to the development of the Endangered Species Act. And wolves are actually one of the very first species that were listed under the Act. Because across the country, even though wolves were indigenous across the United States, there was only a pocket of wolves left in northwestern Montana, Minnesota, less than 200 wolves in Minnesota at that time. And so it was just determined that, wolves were an essential part of our ecosystems. They play a major role in helping to manage our elk and deer and other ungulate populations. And it's a beneficial role. And so the thought was, if we can bring them back in places like Minnesota, why not bring them back in places like Idaho, which has the largest contiguous wilderness and national forest lands in the lower 48 states.
So the reintroduction project gets started, Suzanne. Now, the wolves that came to Idaho didn't come from Minnesota, though, correct? And they did come in on a plane from Canada?
They did, yeah. So wolves have walked on their own from northwestern British Columbia and Alberta down into Idaho. We've tracked and monitored that in the past. But it wasn't easy for us to drive them down. So the easiest thing to do, especially in the wintertime, was to bring them down through the airplanes, and that was with an agreement with the Canadian government, allowing us to go in, work with the Canadian people and some of the veterinarians there, and then through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, capture those wolves, bring them down, and release them into Idaho and Yellowstone National Park.
So let's go to January of 95. You're actually physically in Salmon, Idaho. You're getting ready for these wolves. They arrive on this plane, but there's a glitch. There's a lawsuit actually to block the reintroduction. So who brought this suit?
It was actually two groups. It was the Sierra Club, believe it or not, and the Farm Bureau. And so they
Hmm.
had gone to the federal judge and asking for a stay to stop the reintroduction. And the judge granted that for a period of 2 days. So it was a very short term stay. But the wolves were already in transit at this point. And so we didn't know when that would be lifted. We didn't know if those kennels that they had come in would end up becoming coffins because there was no way to release them. And they couldn't survive in those kennels for very long. We were really
Mm.
concerned that those wolves wouldn't survive that first trip because of the court injunction. And it wasn't until late on the second day, actually today on January 13th, toward the evening, that we got notice that the judge had lifted the order, the stay, and that we were allowed to move the wolves and to release them into the central Idaho wilderness. The Yellowstone wolves were already taken basically in the back of their kennels, in the back of a horse trailer. The rangers had driven all night and then released them into the pen, so they were safe, but the Idaho wolves were not.
Mm. So before we get more into that, Suzanne, I want you to talk about for a minute about the wolf that you actually met when they were first dropped off at this hangar in Salmon. His name translates to older brother. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what he did when you first saw him?
He is an absolutely remarkable wolf. It was the first wild wolf I've ever met eyes with. And his name is Chat Chat, which means older brother in Nez Perce or Nimipu. And the students from the tribe had decorated his collar and had named him. He was one of the first four, and we had taken them to a hangar, just having tried to have a safe place to keep the wolves while we were waiting for the judge's decision. Um, Unlike the other wolves, he wasn't shy. He came to the front of the cage and we met eyes, and I just realized I had never seen a wild animal with that kind of intelligence or
Mm.
self-awareness that he had. And he it was like somebody seeing you all the way down to the bone,
Mm.
it just a completely wild and intelligent being. And um, it was amazing, actually. I'll never forget that moment. And he had just been through Great Falls, Montana, where the Nez Perce elders had blessed the wolves. They must have done a great job because Chat Chat lived to be 14 years old, which is unheard of for wild wolves. They tend to live only till they're about, well, in Idaho, maybe 4 or 5 years. In Yellowstone, typically 7 or 8 years, and that he lived to be 14. And we know that he was blind during the last few years of his life, yet his pack still allowed him to be the alpha male, and
Mm.
they took really good care of him. So um, he must have been good to them.
Yeah. So before we get to the point where, as you said, that you find out that the judge says go ahead with this, I want to talk next about really the mood in Salmon, in the rest of Idaho, in these couple of days. Because my understanding, if I remember correctly, is that Governor Phil Batt was actually considering calling out the National Guard to keep the release from happening. So, how tense was all of this?
It was terribly tense, and it really had coincidentally fallen on the same time that a lot of people in Salmon had received notification that they weren't going to be allowed to do their job because of a trout, an endangered trout in the area, and so they already resented the Endangered Species Act having influence federally on them locally. And at the same time, we were bringing in wolves, and their fear was that wolves would shut down uh, forestry operations or mining or any of those things. It didn't, but people were really concerned. There were signs around town saying, "Kill all the wolves and all the people who brought them here." There were, just threats of an armed ambush on the road taking the wolves into the Corn Creek. I
Mm.
rode with the law enforcement officer that was there to help protect us. But it was um, it was terribly tense, and um, I think that looking back, we were very lucky that it didn't turn into violence.
Hmm. So, the evening of January 13th, as you mentioned, you find out that a judge has said go ahead and release the wolves. So, take us to the next morning. Where are they taken to be set free? Who was there with you?
We were supposed to be flying the wolves in by helicopter, but the weather had turned so bad that we couldn't do that. So we had to arrange for having a snowplow to help open that road up. And if you drove that road, you'll remember that it was just nothing but ice. We were
Hmm.
even warning people to take their seatbelts off because if they slid down into the river, there just wouldn't be time to get out from their car if they were having to struggle with a seatbelt at the same time. It was too slick to even walk across the road. It was incredible, and so we followed the snowplow in, and then there were there were all kinds of people there. There were people from the Wolf Education and Research Center, the Fish and Wildlife Service, there were local reporters, there were uh, county officials. Quite a few people made that journey in. I think there were a good 20 vehicles in line for bringing the wolves in as escort. And then
So,
we lined, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so take us to the point where you're getting ready to set the wolves free because you have four wolves in four
Mhm.
crates. They're lined up. So, which wolf was the first to be set free?
I think that was Moonstar Shadow, which was the wolf that was named by the students
I
in
love
Blaine
it.
County. Yeah, Blaine County students had named that wolf, and then there was Kelly, who was named by students in Cascade, Idaho, and all of the students had received the collars beforehand, so they decorated the collars and sent them back to us. So the wolves were
Mm.
wearing those collars, and
Okay,
then
those
yeah,
then
and
tell
then
us
Chat.
about Elder Brother, right? He was
Right.
released next.
He was released next, and then Akiata was the other wolf, and she was the one that I let go. Um, all the other ones were really happy to get out of the kennel, and Akiata decided she wasn't going anywhere, and so she
Oh,
she just basically bared her teeth and said, "Nope, I'm not leaving. This is too scary, and there's too many people here." And
oh my
so
goodness.
we had to just kind of gently convince her by rocking the crate a bit and stuff, trying to just that please leave the crate because we can't have you go back in it. So eventually she did make a break free, and they all ran, and then they disappeared into the trees with all the snow, and it was just absolutely magical watching them, knowing that these were the truly the first wolves back that would have a chance
Mm.
at bringing about a population again in Idaho.
What was it like for you after that, seeing them all scatter like that? What did you do after the release?
Well, there were some people that were ready with champagne, and then they asked me to howl, and so I was an intern for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. A lot of my job was going out and looking for wolves before the reintroduction, and we did that by howling for them. Wolves love to howl, and they will often respond to other wolves, and so we gave them a blessing of a howl and hoped that they would do well, and they did. Chat Chat went on to become alpha male of his pack. He lived an extraordinarily long life. They all found other members of the reintroduction, and we had pups on the ground here in Idaho at the same time that they did in Yellowstone National Park. The Yellowstone wolves were kept in the acclimation pens for several months, but
Hmm.
then they were released as well. But the difference is Idaho was so important to the reintroduction because our wolf population reached nearly 2,000 wolves before they were delisted. It was very successful because we had such great habitat for them. It's rare for the Yellowstone wolf population to reach 300. And then the Idaho wolves became the basis for wolves today in Oregon, Washington, California. They were the first to be managed by an indigenous tribe, the Nez Perce tribe, when the state of Idaho refused to help manage them. So it was we set a lot of records in first for these wolves, and
Mhm.
they did a beautiful job. They stayed largely away from livestock. We had very few livestock losses. And we know since that they've been brought back that the elk populations have done extremely well in Idaho. In fact, we have more elk on the ground now than we did back in 1995 when we
Mhm.
restored wolves. So they were definitely a missing link in our ecosystem.
So, with my last few minutes left with you, Suzanne, I really want to talk about where we are now in regards to wolves. It has been 30 years, and I think it's fair to say there have been a lot of ups and downs for wolves here in Idaho. So, where are we right now here in our state? Because you've talked about the past couple of years being really difficult for wolf supporters when it comes to Idaho policy.
Honestly, Idaho is the now the worst place in the entire world to be a wolf. It is so bad that we have allowed the fear and propaganda largely to set our management standards for Idaho. In Idaho, wolves can be killed 365 days of the year. There's bounties on them of thousands of dollars, including pups in the dens, which we've seen now where they're, taking pups without even having their eyes open and turning them in for bounty, killing them and then turning them in for bounty. I really never thought I would live to see that kind of archaic brutality. I mean, that was from the former centuries. That's how the state of Idaho eradicated wolves to begin with. And it seems like we're back on that path again, where there's just no acceptance at the state level of having a healthy wolf population. And it's really not about loss or impacts. It's about just, again, the bias and the fear and, not wanting to have this animal on the landscape that's been so shrouded by myth misunderstanding for such a long time. It's really sad to see what's happened, especially when the state of Idaho, had promised to manage wolves here like we do mountain lions and black bears, and yet they're only willing to tolerate a very minimal number, if any. And we have healthy populations of black bears, 20,000, 30,000 in the state, but they're aiming for fewer than 200 wolves statewide. It, it's it just doesn't make sense from an ecological perspective. Wolves are so important to things like helping to cull like chronic wasting disease from our elk herds. I mean, they've proven that they can be here without having much of an impact to livestock or to the elk. So that we are still on this collision course to just try to eradicate the species. We just don't understand it. It's so out of control.
Mm. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, you are having a special webinar tonight about the 30th anniversary and really looking back the last 30 years. So, Suzanne, how can folks sign up for the webinar if they'd like to participate this evening?
I think you have it listed on your website, that there's
We do.
the free webinar. Okay. And it's certainly available on our Facebook page as well. If you go to the International Wildlife Coexistence Network, it's there. It'll be running there as well. And so, if people want to email me, they're welcome to do that. I'm happy to send them the link directly. And I'm at Suzanne at wildlifecoexistence.org.
And I have about 1 minute left with you, but we should let folks know that you will be showing some never before seen footage from the reintroduction tonight from 30 years
We've
ago. So
we've got some
before I
really
let,
great guests, yeah, joining us.
yeah,
Yeah.
really great video. So before I let you go, very quickly, how are you feeling 30 years later?
Uh, I'm not as optimistic as I was when we first brought wolves back. We really thought that people would learn to live with them, that coexistence would be, part of the plan for Idaho. But that Idaho now, I mean, worse than Montana, Wyoming, any of the other states, it's disappointing to see our state, the wilderness state, not accept such a important part of our historic and ecological history here. And so we still have a lot of work to do. And it
Well,
just,
I want to thank you so much.
yeah,
I really want to thank you so very much for taking time to talk with us today. It is incredible to think that it has been 30 years, even with all of these ups and downs. So, Suzanne, thanks for the work you do and thanks for taking time to talk with us today.
thank you, Gemma.
We've been speaking with Suzanne Aisha Stone. She is the executive director of the International Wildlife Coexistence Network, talking about the 30th anniversary of the reintroduction of wolves here into Idaho. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
If you like podcasts like this, explore more from the Boise State Public Radio podcast family. There you'll find a mix of daily news, Idaho Voices, and in-depth series on a wide range of topics. I'm talking wild horses, political scandals, sustainable ranching, and militia groups in a post-January 6th world. Wherever you get your podcasts, just search Boise State Public Radio to find what Idaho's NPR station has in store for you.